Okay, and I'm going to start with a song. Everybody listen up. Oh, we belong to the Zouaves, don't you think we ought to? We're going down to Washington to fight for Abraham's daughter. Thank you. Thank you. Anyway, right, to begin. Many aspiring young volunteers in the American Civil War weren't kind of happy with just being an ordinary volunteer, just wearing dull blue and grey. They thought, let's be Zouaves. Who are Zouaves, I hear you ask? Wait a minute, I will put a picture up. These are a couple of Zouaves from the French army in about 1854. Zouaves were a French idea. During the 1840s, France had a big empire in North Africa, was trying to carve out a big Africa. A tribe called the Zouave tribe, yes, I kid you not, that is their name, offered to fight for the French. A few French settlers joined in with the Zouave tribe as well. And eventually the French thought, these guys are pretty good. They wore a very distinctive uniform, which is the basis of the uniform you see here, of baggy trousers, short jackets, a fez, and a turban. They did very well. Here we see two French flyers of sort of 1854 in typical what you could call Zouave dress. Zouaves did very well in the Crimean War. They stormed Sebastopol, helped storm Sebastopol, were very active, hardy members of the French army. Their exploits were covered in newspapers and magazines across the USA, by many prints about Zouaves, many illustrations. But they were sort of media darlings, you might say, of the mid to late 19th century. Here we see a couple of the same typical Zouave prints. So they're very, very popular gentlemen, to say the least. Here we see the French Zouaves coming to the aid of the British Guards regiment at the Battle of Inkerman. And this is what was said about them. William Howard Russell, who covered Crimean War for the Times, said, the clamour of their trumpets rose above the din of battle, and when they advanced, we knew the day was won. That is praise indeed, really, especially from an Englishman. So the Zouaves did very well in the Crimea, and also in the Second Italian War of Independence. Here they are at the Battle of Palestro. You will see baggy trousers and bayonets well to the fore here. They're merely pitching into the Austrians, who at that time controlled Italy. Napoleon III was trying to get coming on the side of Piedmont, Sardinia, to help create United Italy and also further French interests in Italy as well. That's it in a nutshell. But it's a very, very spectacular print, as you will see. This is the oldest print in my collection, by the way, which I actually found in a second-hand bookshop down St Martin's Lane. And they charged me £10 for it, which I thought wasn't bad at all. So let's say Zouaves have this fearsome reputation. George Brinton McClellan, General George Brinton, was in fact a captain in the Crimea, observing French troops and that kind of thing to tell the folks back home. He called the Zouaves the beau ideal of a soldier, which is praise indeed, absolutely. These are, well, in 1855, a regiment of Guard Zouaves was formed. You can tell they're Guard Zouaves because they have yellow embroidery on the trousers and on their jackets, and they're wearing white turbans around their faces. Zouaves of the line regiments wore green turbans around their faces. But the Zouaves of the Guard looked even more spectacular than Zouaves of the line. The gentleman on the right is obviously officer. They were formed about 1855. And here is another Zouave of the Guard. Now, the young lady on the left is a cantiniere or vivandière. A lot of French regiments, including Zouaves, would have what they call daughters of the regiment, young ladies, often married to a soldier, often married more than once if that soldier got killed, who would dispense tobacco, whiskey, and that kind of thing. So in a sense that they were sutlers, but they wore a feminized Zouave uniform. As you can see, this young lady was wearing a skirt over the Zouave trousers, and she's got a pretty elaborate turban on there as well. Now, some Zouave regiments in the American army, in the Union Army, would copy this style. So, and here's a young lady who was a Vivandière or Cantinière. Sorry, my French accent is appalling. I know that. It's a shame because I am part French, but anyway. This is Mary Tebby or Teppy. She was Vivandière in the 140th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, Collis Zouaves. As you can see, she's wearing a feminized version of the Zouave uniform. Note that on her chest, she is wearing a Kearney Cross, one of the highest decorations of the American Civil War. She's also armed as well for trouble. We don't know if Mary actually saw any trouble or whether that was just for show. I believe she survived the war, and unlike many ladies, 19th century ladies, she actually saw the horrors of war firsthand, which was unusual then for ladies to actually witness, to witness that. Mary, I believe, was wounded in the ankle. She lived until 1914, but unfortunately committed suicide due to the pain. So, but did good service. Okay, this man, Alma E. Ellsworth. Don't he look good? Does he look grand? Looks every inch a soldier. Alma never saw combat, never saw a shot fired in anger. Yet he is responsible for what is called the Zouave craze in America. Okay, now I should explain about American Zouave uniforms. They are either fanciful adaptations of the Zouave dress, such as the uniform I'm wearing, or they are almost identical copies of French Zouave uniforms. Okay, so Zouave uniforms in America cover a wide spectrum of styles. Some of them really don't look too much like Zouaves at all, even though the regiments called themselves Zouaves. I guess, the thing about the Zouaves is more about the Zouave ethos rather than anything else. You know, I mean, if you wear a Zouave uniform, I've got three. You tend to swagger a bit more than other troops if you're a reenactment. It gives you a sense of pride, put it that way, more so than ordinary uniforms that are worn at American Civil War reenactments. Anyway, this is Elmer E. Ellsworth, looking very spectacular. Ellsworth was a penniless part-time lawyer and military enthusiast. One day he met a gentleman called Charles A. de Villiers, who'd been with the Zouave regiment in the Crimea. Charles filled Ellsworth's head, sorry, attention slipping, with tales of daring do about the Zouaves. Ellsworth thought, sounds interesting. I will form my own Zouave regiment. Well, anyway, and here they are. These are the United States Zouave cadets. The gentleman on the left is wearing the full dress of the United States cadets, the so-called chasseur uniform. The gentleman on the right is wearing the sort of drill uniform. You know, what a great drill uniform. You know, Ellsworth takes the United States Zouave cadets on a 19-city East Coast tour, and they do some pretty exotic drill routines. In a sense, it's like Strictly Come Dancing, I suppose. It's military, but at the same time, it's very theatrical as well. You know, these guys can sort of form pyramids. They can form squares, triangles. Exotic drill, but the Americans absolutely love it. You know, so they rave about this. Stories of Ellsworth and his cadets are featured in a lot of papers. Ellsworth is also a real heartthrob with the ladies as well, as you've seen from the previous picture. He's a good-looking guy, very small man. I'd imagine about 5'6", but then so is Napoleon. So who cares? Anyway, here they are giving a drill display. One of the gentlemen on the left-hand side is Abraham Duryea, more of him later, who would go on to form the 5th New York Volunteer Infantry, but more of them later. It's said that Duryea saw the Zouave cadets and thought to himself, it's interesting, you know, perhaps I could do the same tonight with my chums. Anyway, as I say, so there they are in action at drill. Okay. Ellsworth does his tour with his Zouave cadets, but they prove too expensive to maintain. As we've seen, they wear 3 uniforms. And he thinks to himself, when the guns fire and force something, he thinks to himself, war is coming. What I will do is I will raise the 1st Zouave Regiment to travel to Washington, so we can get into the fight very, very early. And here are 2 members. This is Francis Brownell on the right. We'll come to Francis later, so it's a bit convoluted, but I will come. Francis E. Brownell on my right, and Noah Lane Farnham, gentleman whose head is quite obscured on the left. Okay. So Ellsworth forms the 11th New York Volunteer Infantry, the 1st Fire Zouaves, whose uniform I'm wearing today. As I say, it doesn't really look Zouave, but it's a broad interpretation of Zouave uniforms. Now, Ellsworth is, I think in May 1861, Ellsworth is tasked with securing Alexandria, Virginia for the Union. He and his Zouaves go into Alexandria. Ellsworth sees a Confederate flag flying on top of the Marshall House, a tavern in Alexandria. Ellsworth is incandescent with rage. He's a Union man through and through. God bless him. He goes upstairs, tears the flag down, comes down with the flag. As he's coming down with the flag, he is shot by the tavern owner, James Jackson, shot dead. Behind Ellsworth was Francis E. Brownell. Brownell, in turn, shoots Jackson down and kills him. It was lots of newspapers said at the time that, in fact, that Brownell had bayoneted Jackson as well. Brownell always denied this. Brownell won a Congressional Medal of Honor for his action, I believe the first issue of the war. And out of this great response to Brownell, he was later promoted to 2nd Lieutenant in regular army. The gentleman on the right is Noah Lane Farnham, the 2nd in command of the Fire Zouaves. Again, a small man. He was Ellsworth's best buddy. When the Fire Zouaves marched down Broadway on the way to the war, Ellsworth and Noah Lane Farnham marched proudly arm in arm down Broadway. As I say, Farnham leads the Zouaves into action at First Bull Run, that cataclysmic first battle. Hi, hi, hi is the Fire Zouaves war chant. They go into battle very proudly. They march across Henry House Hill with the American Marines. There's a company of 2 companies of American Marines, but they're badly shot up by Confederate artillery fire. Farnham is hit in the head, struck on the head, knocked off his horse. Anyway. The Zouaves really, the officers try to rally them, but it's sort of panic city, as it was for really long time, really. So they tend to panic a bit. Under heavy artillery fire, they're obviously state of panic. I know as a reenactor that if you've got artillery out there, and you imagine the shells coming towards you, then by God, you're going to panic, unless you're really, really tough. Artillery fire, in a sense, is more terrifying than basketballs. It does tend to make you think to yourself, I'm going to get out. Anyway, as I say, Brownell was killed. The Fire Zouaves panic a bit. To make matters worse, they are then assailed by Jeb Stuart's cavalry, famed 1st Virginia, who slice into the Zouaves. The Zouaves cope with the cavalry not too badly. A lot of them fight back. A lot of Stuart's cavalry are unhorsed and damaged quite severely. So they don't do that badly. People who actually witnessed the Fire Zouaves in action said, they didn't do too badly. At one stage, they were in fact involved in a tussle for the 69th New York militia flag, which they helped to recapture from the Rebs. So bodies of them didn't, as a whole, they didn't do that well, but bodies of them did fight on very spectacularly. Okay, now Farnham was killed at Bull Run, mortally wounded at Bull Run. Now Ellsworth got a Union regiment raised in his name, in his honor, several years after Bull Run. This was the 44th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Again, their Zouave uniforms are a bit, shall we say, creative. They did very well late in the war, Battle of the Wilderness especially, and they did very, very well. So Ellsworth would have been proud of his lads. Nobody seemed to bother about Farnham. As far as I know, no regiments were raised in his honour. So Ellsworth gets all the glory. Farnham really is largely being forgotten about, even though he did see some fire and led the 11th New York, the Fire Zouaves, into battle. Even though it was a very, very short-lived regiment, the Fire Zouaves, the 11th New York Volunteer Infantry, had no less than 2 uniforms issued to them in the space of a year. This is the first uniform. Unfortunately, it wore out very quickly, apparently. I'll show it to you in colour in a second. It wore out very, very quickly. Although Brownell's uniform, the gentleman we saw in the last picture, his uniform is or was displayed in a Manassas Visitor Centre, complete with kepi. It was there the last time I was there, but that was 4 or 5 years ago. So whether it's still or not, I don't know. If you look at the uniform, you can see it's not of the best quality, but somehow it's managed to survive these past, 150 years. Second uniform is the one I'm wearing, although I'm wearing a kepi rather than a fez. On a hot day, a fez is absolutely useless. If you're follically challenged, like me, because the fez is worn at the back of the head, you get terrible sunburn across there. You really do, especially in the States where temperatures are mega, especially in Virginia. And it's called fez head today by reenactors. It was called fez head back then. So they're not, fezzes aren't very good at protecting the head. Kepis are. You've got a lot to go over your skull. Okay, so here we see officers and men with the spectacular flag as well, wearing the second uniform, which is basically what I'm wearing. I'm wearing a red fireman shirt. I could be in the Monkeys, couldn't I? Who remembers the Monkeys? Excellent. In fact, I think this is probably why I like the Fire Zouaves uniform so much, that they wore Monkeys shirts, or the Monkeys wore shirts like that. It's a red fireman shirt, blue baggy trousers. These are more chasseur pattern than Zouave pattern, but if I talk about chasseurs as well, we'll be here all bloody afternoon. So I'm wearing regulation booties, brogans, and regulation socks, or just socks really, with my trousers tucked in. Actually, underneath this, I'm wearing an ordinary civilian shirt, and that's about it. It is a very comfortable uniform. As I say, Fire Zouaves only lasted, well, up until Bull Run. After that, the entire spirit had gone. They've lost 2 leaders in very short space of time, so their morale is very low. Plus, they can go back to their day jobs as firemen in New York, which is why they were called Fire Zouaves. Fire Zouaves were mainly of tough Irish personnel who would very often, on the way to a fire, would actually fight each other to get to the fire first of all. While they were in Washington, they weren't very well liked by the more sedate population of Washington, who couldn't come to grips with their manly behavior. In New York, they're very popular, but in Washington, they were sort of frowned upon until they put out a fire at Willard's Hotel, where the popularity rose. They actually went back into their old trade and put out a fire. So they did okay. Well, I should point out that when Ellsworth was killed, died, Washington mourned. Flags were at half-mast. His body was on display. You could file past it. He was, and he was a sort of another media figure. Ladies especially loved him. He was very popular indeed. So there was a real sense of loss, especially from Abraham Lincoln, who'd employed Ellsworth in his law office. Ellsworth had the idea that he would be that he would become the head of some kind of soldier bureau to raise Zouave regiments and militia regiments, but it never actually happened. But for a man who never tasted battle, and indeed never fired a shot in anger, his influence on American military history is absolutely tremendous, to say the least. Right. Oh, here the Fire Zouaves in colour. On my left, they're wearing first uniform. Um, that is a picture set outside the Capitol. The fire Zouaves in Washington actually once raided a shoe shop and said, "Send the bill to old Abe." The Capitol in those days was finished, so they would often swing on the ropes in the Capitol building. This is their second uniform in kind. It's a red fireman shirt. They didn't all wear fireman shirts. Some wore white shirts. Again, you can see the spectacular flag there. Now, as far as I know, the flag still exists. For many years, it was lost, and then it was found wrapped up in a box. But today it survives. It's a very elaborate flag with fireman's helmet on it, ladders on it. You know, it really is. I've called it a flag, haven't I? Should call it colours. Flags go up and down a pub. They are really spectacular colours that hopefully I can see in person next year. Anyway, so the guy on to my right, to my left, to my right is wearing a white shirt. A lot of Zouaves wore scarves as well. I have a scarf. I don't wear it because it's too bloody hot in hot weather. At Bull Run, it was over. It was hotter than the actual first Bull Run, which was, and it was. I've never been so hot in my life. To wear a scarf was just terrible. Right, here's me, first Bull Run. This was 2011. I missed out. I missed out on 125th, so I went to the 150th instead. And so it's very, very, very hard. Anyway, this is me, and here are the rest of the fire Zouaves behind us. Most of the fire Zouaves were actually, as I am, members of the 5th New York, converted for that day into fire Zouaves. But it's one of the only times I've actually slept outside at night. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, somebody started banging a drum. Just got off to sleep, and I could have killed them. Anyway, it was a good reenactment. But very, very hard. As I say, going to action just like the original fire Zouave, I was going, hi, hi, hi. These are Company K, the Irish Zouaves, Moha's Irish Zouaves. For anybody Irish here, I'm probably pronouncing Moha the wrong way. It's Meagher, but nobody, including Irish people, seem to be able to pronounce it. I say Ma, some people say Moha, some people say Meagher. Nobody seems to be quite sure of Moha's pronunciation. Here's a gentleman sitting down in the centre. These are Company K, the Irish Zouaves, who are at Bull Run as well. And in fact, were involved with the fire Zouaves. You know, they were fighting together, mixed in with the fire Zouaves. You'll see at the back two of the members appearing through wearing havelocks, or havelocks, named after Sir Henry Havelock or Havelock, who invented them in the Indian Mutiny. Basically to keep soldiers' heads cool. No, they don't. If it's a hot day and you've got this damn havelock round your neck and shoulders, you get even bloody hotter. You really do. Plus, you can't hear a damn thing. Really, you've got people shouting it. You can't hear them. Some reports at the time said that instead of actually wearing havelocks, soldiers would use them for straining their coffee. That I can really believe. I'm sure that's a true story. Anyway, like the fire Zouaves, Company K, the Irish Zouaves, who again mainly Irish, as the name suggests, really didn't last beyond Bull Run. I mean, the 69th New York State Militia, as it became, did, and Moha was the guy who founded the famous Irish Brigade in the Army with the green flags that we all know and love. He was the guy who actually founded that brigade and did very well. Although at Bull Run he had an inauspicious time at Bull Run, he was knocked unconscious. But he managed to recover. He was then rescued by a trooper of the 2nd United States Cavalry, who somehow managed to haul Moha from the ground to his horse's saddle. Morgan again falls off, and the cavalryman thinks, "Had enough of this. I've tried," but manages to hitch and lift on a passing wagon, on a retreating wagon back to Washington. The trouble is, the wagon breaks down. Morgan is pitched into Cub Run, completely drenched, but does manage to make it back to Washington in the end. After about 2 or 3 days, he does manage to stagger in. Moore was a man who liked to drink. He became governor in Montana, I believe, but died after falling off the back of a boat, allegedly. Anyway, a colourful character. Moore had been imprisoned in Tasmania by the British for his anti-British sentiments, but he escaped and came to America, where he carved out a career for himself. Now, a lot of another famous person who founded the Zouave unit was Lew Wallace. Yeah, Wallace later in the war formed the 11th Indiana Volunteers, Wallace's Zouaves, and here they are in one of the again they had two uniforms to change this. Uh, it's a pretty self-explanatory picture. Again, although they call themselves Zouaves, it's a very wide interpretation of the Zouave uniform, because basically it's all in grey, but a very colourful uniform nonetheless. There's Major sitting at the back there. We all probably recognise these gentlemen. Who are they? They are the Tiger Rifles, Company B of Wheat's First Special Battalion. These were about the only, I think, the only Zouave regiment to fight at the front. Well, not regiment, company to fight at the front. You probably notice in the centre this guy, a bit like Tony Blackburn. I don't know why, but anyway, there you go. But it's a good illustration by dear old Bill Youngsman. Again, they were raised by a Robideau Wheat, who'd been an adventurer in South America. I believe he'd served with Garibaldi as well. But he formed them, and they became known as the Louisiana Tigers. Apparently, they preferred dropping their muskets and charging with Bowie knives. How true is that? I don't actually know. I'd have stuck to my musket, but that's what they did. They really only survived the Bull Run, a bit like the Fire Zouaves. They just had a one battle experience, put it that way. But the term Louisiana Tigers would in fact be transferred to all Louisiana troops who became known as Louisiana Tigers. Their reputation was that good. I should point out that most Zouave regiments were formed in the north. The south had an interest, but it saw Zouave regiments more as a northern Yankee idea. So you don't get that many Zouave regiments formed in the south. In total in the Civil War, there were over 70 regiments, but they were mainly in the north. So you don't get that many in the south, formed in the south. These are the 114th Pennsylvania Infantry. 114th Volunteer 114th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry in about 1863. Wallace's Zouaves. Again, this shows you yet another Union Army Zouave regiment. I'll show you a couple more so you can get the sort of gist of what they look like. Again, it's a very famous photo. A lot of people actually thought, and still a lot of people thought and still think it's a picture of Frenchmen. No, it's not. They're all Pennsylvanians, but they look very Gallic in this, to me anyway. But it's a nice photo. You've probably seen that before. I expect it's in the Civil War books. Right, here we have the 10th New York, another Zouave unit. This is the 13th New York Volunteer Infantry. Some regiments, infantry regiments, just had a company of Zouaves, just had one company of Zouaves. Anybody else will be dressed in regulation gear or variations of regulation gear. The Zouave guy in the 13th is there. He's actually wearing quite an authentic looking Zouave uniform. So there he is. And who's this? Who is this man? It's me! In my 5th New York uniform, which I thought of wearing today, but to be honest with you, to put it on is a bit complicated first thing on a Saturday morning, shopping at Sainsbury's. Once you've got it on, it's fine, but putting it on is a bit of a drag. So anyway, I thought I'd wear the Fire Zouave today. Right, okay, where are we? I wasn't that politically challenged in those days. This is a very, very old photograph. Even though I'm still as good looking as I'm sure you're already agree. On the cover of this issue, I kid you not, actually sold out. This is true. I'm not just saying that. So I've never made it to the cover of Rolling Stone, but I've made it to the cover of Military Illustrated, which I think is more valuable. Anyway, you can see here that Zouave face, it's trimmed in yellow, Zouave jacket, and when we come to the next photo, I think you'll see better what I'm wearing. Yeah, here we are. Okay. Continuing the theme, this is me from the side. Now, you will notice here these leather greaves. They are called jambiers. They were a speciality. Well, all French Zouave regiments wore. Basically, they're leather greaves which fit above the gaiters, which you tuck your trousers into. But they literally are terrible to do up. They've got little leather straps down the side, and trying to do those up can take about, or takes me anyway, it's not pretty yet. Can take about half an hour. So if you're trying to get ready, dress for battle very quickly, leave your jambiers. Right, gentlemen, to my right, left is a Zouave, original member of the 5th New York, complete with Freddie Mercury moustache. You know. It's interesting that companies E and I of the 5th New York were what is known as skirmish companies. They were armed with Sharps rifles. You can see this gentleman is a member of the company E and I, E or I, because he's got a Sharps rifle. Anyway, what I should point out is that this pair, Zouaves, are Zouaves ideally dressed. Obviously, due to the rigors of campaigning, they might lose a jacket. They might even have to wear ordinary Zouave, or ordinary infantry forage caps. So, you know, after a couple of years in the field, perhaps it wouldn't look as immaculate as these two. It'd probably be a bit doubtful. But if they had to, they would patch and repatch their trousers many, many times. They always wanted to keep the Zouave trousers on the go, you know. Now, equipment-wise, I've got standard Union infantry equipment, haversack, canteen, everything you need, everything you need. I'm carrying my old Enfield 3 rifle in there. Let me mention this curious object here, what is termed today as the hanging down, for a better technical term. Zouaves would wear a sash around their waist, which is, again, is very difficult to put on. It takes two of you. If I was wearing the sash today, I'd put it there, then I'd wrap myself into it. It's about 12 foot long. I would wrap myself into the sash. Some of the fellows who would have to stand over there, wrap me into it. Has to be very tight, otherwise it's going to slip. Even though I've got my waist wells with an SNY, State of New York, catch over it. So there you go. Oh, that photo was taken in Highgate Wood, by the way, in North London. You couldn't do that these days. You definitely be carrying a firearm around. I'd be arrested in about 5 minutes. But times were more innocent back in was that 1995? I think that was taken. Okay, here are two Zouave officers. They look very slick. The gentleman on that gentleman there, that is the late great Brian Bahanker, of whom you may have heard. Knows everything about knew everything about the American Civil War. Has been a consultant on various films, including Cold Mountain. And if you look at the opening credits or the opening of Glory, you will see him. He's one of the officers marching along with a sword. I'm also in Glory as well, but I don't have such a prominent role. I'm also in Gettysburg as well. I'm also in Dances with Wolves. So there you go. But blink your eyes, you're going to miss them. Okay. As you can see, baggy trousers, but kind of like this, what you call chasseur pattern trousers. But again, I'm not going to talk about chasseurs today because I'll be here all afternoon. But anyway, yeah, Brian died unfortunately about 10 years ago now, but left one hell of a legacy really. He was Mr. Civil. He also probably saved my life as well, but I'm not going into that at the moment because again, I'll be here all afternoon. Right, the 5th New York's first action was at Big Bethel. A lot of people don't realize that Big Bethel is in fact the first land action of the American Civil War. It's not Bull Run, okay? Union forces were trying to dislodge a Confederate encampment, but didn't succeed. The 5th New York are charging into battle here. They probably noted this, there's an officer there, obviously. They sort of had this, 5th New York in the early years had this curious habit of putting their turbans sort of round their necks and underneath their fezzes. This seems to be an early war thing. You don't get it later on. Anyway, here they are, big battle, spectacular scene of them charging into action there. But again, it was not a Union success. And the 5th New York weren't at Bull Run. Okay, this is the 5th New York at Gaines Mill. How can I make this succinct as possible? Okay, the gentleman here carrying the regimental colours, which we're going to look in close up later on, is John H. Berrien. He was maddened by the fact that his brother had been killed in the battle a few minutes earlier. When Francis Spellman, the regimental flag bearer, collapsed, Berrien rushed forward, picked up the flag, and this sounds like pure Hollywood, but it's true. He actually walked 30 paces in front of the 5th New York and shook his fist at the enemy. You know, amongst all this fire, there you are with the flag, shaking your fist at an enemy, and he survived. Anyway, he was joined by Sergeant Allison, carrying national colours, who also came to the front, shaking his fist. So it sounds like pure Hollywood, but in fact, it's the truth. It happened. The 5th New York were being held in line by their officers, but at that, the officers couldn't hold them back. They charged into battle against some South Carolinian troops. After the war, the South Carolinian soldiers said it was the most desperate, gallant charge I ever saw. So they gained fame amongst the Confederates. This is a reproduction of the flag. This was done by Stephen W. Hill for Stephen W. Hill for the 5th New York several years ago. He's a very, very good flag maker. Does a lot of American stuff. It's got the arms of New York on the front and on the back on the obverse and reverse. It's both the arms of New York. The flag, I believe, is still in existence. I'm sure it's in Albany and some government offices there. So I think it still survives. What state it's in, I don't know. Obviously, it wouldn't be this like that. It's been shot through many times, I think. But again, I would be proud to carry a flag, colours like that. Ah, here we have Charles Jones. He's lucky to survive Gaines because his fez was actually shot through by a bullet. It didn't hit his head. You know. Now, Charles Jones is a descendant of a friend of mine called John Soden, who's traced his ancestors' records way back, and has in fact got a photo of his illustrious ancestor downstairs at his house. But obviously, if Charles had died at Gainesville, there would be no John. But Charles actually, New Yorker like John now lives in Virginia. He enlisted at 17, which is a year under the actual enlistment date. Saw lots of service with the 5th New York, but survived. He died in 1925, which isn't bad going, really. But we're going to talk about aging Zouaves, including me, a bit later on. But yeah, that's Charles. And actually, if John was here and you put him next to that photo, there is a family similarity, especially around the eyes. It's quite uncanny that even after all that time, the genes obviously are still there. And the genes are there another way because John's entered the service as well. He was in the United States Air Force. His son, as a sergeant, was in the 82nd Air All-American Division and saw some pretty hairy service in Afghanistan. But fortunately survived. Right. Vortex of Hell. Schroeder Publishing. If you're a 5th New York fan, or I've turned you on to the 5th New York and the Zouaves in general this afternoon, this is the book to have. It's a huge tome about that big. The cover is by Keith Rocco, another friend of mine. So what's going on here? Well, let me start by saying that the Vortex of Hell refers to the Vortex of Hell that the 5th went through with the Battle of Manassas. It was the costliest battle for them. And I'll say it now, otherwise I get it wrong. They suffered the most casualties in the shortest space of time of any Union regiment during a single day's battle of the American Civil War. I hope that makes sense. I'll repeat it again for anyone who wants me to. Okay, so basically, in 7 minutes, they lost 120 men. They had about 179 wounded, and I think it was over 20 captured. They went into battle that day with less than 600 men. So basically, it was, I would think, mass isn't very good, but they lost over 50%. So it's a very, very costly day. What happened was they were struck on three sides by Longstreet's corps, boom, overwhelmed. Some people said that the fifth fired, but they fired too high, and this enabled Longstreet to, primarily the Hood's Texas Brigade, to overwhelm them in a very short space of time. And yet, despite this carnage, there was humanity in the midst of all this. A wounded Zouave was lying down next to a Confederate, and, and the Zouave actually took the turban from around his fez and wrapped the Confederate's wounds. Now, this is what makes us human in a way, doesn't it? In the midst of this terrible carnage, we still somehow find time to help somebody just literally trying to kill us, you know. And that always chokes me when I talk about this. As I say, the fifth lost many, many men. There was a note of grim humor when it was every man for himself. The fifth were trying to retreat, and some of them waded through a stream, but their pantaloons, their trousers, were pierced by rebel bullets. As they came out of the stream, fountains of water poured out of their pantaloons, which provided the Confederates with some amusement. A very poetic Confederate said that the red trousers of the Zouaves who were lying dead or wounded on the ground looked like so many poppies in a green field. That is poetry in a strange way. Anyway, the fifth year was very, very badly cut up. It was their costliest battle. For the next battles, one of which was Shepherdstown, they were at Antietam, but they didn't suffer that much at Antietam. They had light casualties. This is a monument to the 5th New York, I think around the 1880s, which shows you how the battlefield was. It's a sort of quite a grim kind of scene, really. And this is a monument as it is today, and the young whippersnapper there is me. It is the site of three very credible ghost stories, which have been repeated by independent sources down the years, which I can believe. It's very I don't get spooked on many battlefields, but behind the monument I do. Some people have claimed to have seen a headless ghost wandering around looking. Others have claimed to see Zouave just marching around. I really don't know, but one lady in 60s had to be hospitalized. She was so terrified about this that she had to be carried off by ambulance apparently and put in hospital. But she really freaked her out. I can believe it. I don't like walking behind the monument on my own. It's very, I can't describe it. You'd have to go there to find it out. Now, in the Marshall House down the road, two wounded Zouaves were carried there. And in the floorboards, they've carved their initials, which is still there, which you can still see. Obviously, they're covered up, but you can still see where the two Zouaves, I can't remember their names, actually carve their initials into the building. It's interesting. So if you go to the Marshall House, which is about half a mile away, you can see it there. Ask the park rangers. So this is the monument today. A nice monument. On August the 30th every year, the anniversary of Bull Run, the fifth will gather at the monument in fifth uniform, and they will read out the names of the dead and the wounded. I think I was last there about 5 or 6 years ago. I read out those who've been killed, and they put wreaths up as well. Members of the public can come up, but it's a very inspiring day, you know. As I say, there were the boys of summer, to quote it, but the deadly summer of 1862, you know. But again, it's very emotive to actually just stand there and ponder on Right. The fifth legacy, 15 York's legacy, did not end with Bull Run. Basically, a lot of spirit had gone for a regiment. They were war weary. However, two regiments were raised out of the ruins of the 5th New York, I could say. This first regiment, well, not the first regiment, but one of the regiments was the 165th New York Volunteer Infantry. If you look, the gentleman on there, that is Felix Agnus. He was a Frenchman, as the name suggests. Now, he served with the 3rd Regiment of Zouaves in the Crimean War. He's a genuine article. And also with Garibaldi's guys as well. It is said that he turned up to a meeting of people interested in forming the 5th New York dressed in his French Zouave uniform. And Abraham Duryea thought, who was the founder of the 5th New York, thought, he looks good, we'll copy him. Anyway, Agnus, or Agnes, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, had a meteoric rise to the 5th New York, did very well, got promoted time and time again, and ended up commanding the 165th New York. Oh, these the gentlemen by his side are just two of his officers, again wearing pretty theatrical uniforms there. Very nice uniform. Again, note the fact they're wearing gaiters, and those are the backs of the uniforms. Agnus's uniform still exists, by the way. It's either the Baltimore Historical Society who got it, or the Maryland Historical Society who got it. I'm not sure they call themselves Baltimore, Maryland, but you can still see it to this day. These are men of the 165th. Again, the uniform is not too dissimilar to the 5th New York. Really? Okay. Who's this gentleman? This is Cleveland Winslow. He survived Second Bull Run, even though he's mounted on a horse, apparently. A martinet, not popular with the men, but respected by them. But I've always thought you can see his attitude by the way he's standing there. You wouldn't want to mess with Cleveland, put it that way. Now, he forms the 5th New York Veteran Battalion, but it's late in the war, a difficulty. What he does is he transfer various soldiers who still have service to go in other regiments into his regiment. Okay. Plus, I believe there were some original 5th New Yorkers in his regiment as well. So he manages to cobble the 5th New York veteran volunteers together, but it takes him time. But he's a real stickler for accuracy. You had to wear your fez a certain way. He was just do it by the look, but a very brave man. This strange combination of being a real stickler for the discipline, but a brave man himself, which is why his men respected him, even though they hated him. To keep the memory of the Zouave legacy alive, an entire Zouave brigade was formed, if you like, from 3 regiments. The 146th New York Volunteer Infantry, the 140th New York Volunteer Infantry, and the 155th Pennsylvania were brigaded together later in the war. You can see the guys in blue, the 146th New York Volunteer Infantry, Garrard's Tigers, they called themselves. They wear a blue uniform. The trousers aren't fully Zouave, they're more of a chasseur pattern. If you go to the Gettysburg Visitor Center, the new one, they have or had an almost complete 146 uniform in their display cabinets. Presumably it's still there, I can't see why they, but it's a very nice uniform, light blue with yellow facings, yellow trim. Here they are going to battle at Saunders Field, which, by the way, you can still visit. I've been there a couple of times. They all charge in, but very few of them came out. But as one officer said, we fought the Rebs with the bayonet as well as the bullet, which really sums it up. They go in with the bayonet. and do quite a lot of damage. Okay. The Zouave legacy does not end with the ending of the American Civil War. In fact, many National Guard units would adopt Zouave dress. So you've got men in the up to the 1870s, even the 1880s, in National Guard regiments wearing Zouave dress. You know, the feelings are still there for Zouaves. These are gentlemen from the 5th New York in the early 1900s on parade. They're still on parade. You know, I mean, we talked about Charles Jones a couple of hours ago, who survived the war, you know, up until 1925. So it's pretty good. But these are old vets of the 5th New York, still out there, still on parade. You know. They form veteran associations to keep the memory of the Zouaves alive. Ah, yes, Hiram Duryea may have been a distant cousin of Abraham Duryea, who founded the Hiram spells his name Duryea. Duryea, Abraham Duryea, the founder of the 5th New York, spells his second name Duryee. Like me, they were Huguenots, as were my ancestors. Unfortunately, mine came here, and theirs went to the States. Anyway, he survived the war. Again, he saw some pretty tough action at Gaines Mill. He was on his horse Blackjack, in front of the men, trying to keep them calm, you know, casually riding up and down on his horse. How people do this, I have no idea. And a shell landed underneath his horse, but didn't explode. The horse didn't flinch, apparently, which shows very good training. And Duryea said, "Boys, the horse stands it well." And somebody shouted from the ranks, "And by God, so does the rider." We were impressed, you know, very impressed at this. It's something they wouldn't ordinarily have done because, again, the 5th New York's officers were very austere and you didn't sort of mix with them that much. But the men were so impressed at Duryea's courage, not to mention that his horse, that somebody had to say something. Right. Anyway, Duryea, he lived until 1914. He was shot dead by his lunatic son Chester. Yeah, more than once. Chester, I think, opened up with a pistol and shot him. That was it. It's just ironic that you survive the war, and yet a member of your own family kills you. You know, as I say, that was 1914. I think. Now, Zouaves in the French army still survive as well. They do very good service in the disastrous Franco-Prussian War. They do very well there. Of course, I should have pointed out that what I didn't point out was that French Zouaves were in the French were part of the forces sent to the French intervention in Mexico back when the American Civil War was going on. They dawned fortifications at Puebla, for instance, very, very costly time for the French in Mexico. It was part of Napoleon III's empire building activities, just trying to emulate his uncle Napoleon. If America had gone to war with France back in 1860, then maybe French Zouaves would have fought American Zouaves. But fortunately, it didn't happen. But it's it's an interesting thing to ponder. These are Zouaves in 1913 on manoeuvres. Often on campaign, French Zouaves wear white trousers as opposed to red trousers. In 1914, they marched off to war in uniforms that wouldn't have been out of place in the Crimean. The weaponry would, but that's how they were dressed early in the war. Later in the war, they changed their uniform to that of standard, more or less standard French uniforms. But you can tell if you see an Adrian helmet and it's got a crescent underneath the grenade on top, that was a mark of the Zouave regiment. Okay, so off they go to war in 1915, do good service again, very costly things, very costly experience for them. They're also 1939, World War II, they're there as well, but they're wearing American uniforms. It's nice that America sort of thanks them by supplying them with infantry uniforms back in a way. There are no French Zouaves today. They were stood down, I believe, in the 1960s. The last regiment was stood down, unfortunately. Anyway, so Zouaves are still remembered by reenactment groups, maniacs like me, magazine articles, that kind of thing. Also being remembered in a very unusual way. Are you there, Simone? Yes, you are. There you are, Simone. Now, I think she looks almost as good in my 50 York uniform as I do. The trouble is the heels are not suitable for campaigning. You know. Anyway, so there you go.